The stagecoach rattled into Twin Falls, Idaho Territory, on a blistering August afternoon in 1876, carrying cargo that would change everything for a lonely rancher named Daniel Jackson. Though he did not know it yet, as he stood waiting on the dusty Main Street with his hat clutched nervously in his weathered hands. Daniel was 30 years old, tall and lean from hard work, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of summer wheat fields. He had placed an advertisement for a mail-order bride 6 months prior, driven by loneliness that echoed through his empty ranch house like wind through canyon walls. The responses had been few, but one letter had stood out from a woman named Lily Harper, written in careful, elegant script by someone who signed as her sister. The letter explained that Lily was 22, hardworking, and eager for a fresh start in the West. What it had not mentioned, what Daniel was about to discover, was that Lily could not hear a single word he might say to her. The stagecoach door swung open, and the driver helped down a young woman who looked around with eyes so wide and frightened that Daniel felt something twist in his chest. She was smaller than he had imagined, with dark blonde hair pinned up under a simple bonnet and a threadbare traveling dress that had seen better days. Her hands clutched a single worn carpet bag, and when the driver spoke to her, pointing in Daniel's direction, she did not turn her head. The driver touched her shoulder and she startled violently, spinning around with such panic in her expression that Daniel stepped forward instinctively. When her eyes met his, Daniel saw fear there, but also determination, and something else he could not quite name. He opened his mouth to greet her, to introduce himself, but she was watching his face with an intensity that made him pause. She set down her bag, and her hands moved in swift, graceful patterns that meant nothing to him. His confusion must have shown because her face fell, color draining from her cheeks as tears welled in her eyes. The stagecoach driver cleared his throat. "She tried explaining something to me earlier, but I could not make heads or tails of it. Kept moving her hands like that. Maybe she is touched in the head." "She is not touched," Daniel said sharply, though he had no idea what was happening. He could see intelligence in those frightened eyes, could see the way she was trying so hard to communicate something important. He stepped closer, moving slowly so he would not startle her again, and picked up her bag. Then he gestured toward his wagon waiting nearby, trying to make his intentions clear through movement alone. Lily watched him for a long moment, seeming to assess whether he meant her harm. Then she gave a small nod and followed him to the wagon. Daniel helped her up onto the seat, noting how she flinched when he offered his hand but took it anyway. Her palm was small and cold despite the heat of the day. The ride out to his ranch took 40 minutes through rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers. Daniel kept trying to speak to her, to ask questions, but she never responded to his voice. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her hands twisted together in her lap so tightly her knuckles were white. It was only when he touched her arm gently to point out his property in the distance that she looked at him, and he saw tears streaming silently down her face. His ranch house was modest but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a main room with a stone fireplace he had constructed himself. He had spent the past week cleaning every corner, determined to make a good impression on his new bride. Now, as he helped Lily down from the wagon and led her inside, he wondered what she thought of it, wondered what she thought of him, wondered how he was supposed to build a life with someone when they could not even speak to each other. Lily stood in the middle of the main room, still clutching her bag, looking lost and terrified. Daniel set his hat on a peg and ran his hand through his hair, trying to think. He pointed to one of the bedrooms, then to her, trying to indicate it was hers. She watched his gesture but did not move. He walked to the bedroom door and opened it. showing her the room he had prepared with fresh linens and wildflowers in a jar on the small table. She followed slowly and peered inside, then looked back at him with questions written all over her face. He stepped back, giving her space, and gestured that she could go in. She did, setting her bag on the bed, and then she turned and did something unexpected. She pointed to herself, then brought her fingers to her ear and shook her head firmly. Then she pointed to her mouth and shook her head again. Finally, she made those graceful hand movements once more, slower this time, as if hoping he might suddenly understand. Daniel felt understanding dawn like sunrise after a long night. She could not hear. She could not speak, at least not the way he did. Those hand movements were her language, her way of communicating, and he did not know a single word of it. He pointed to himself. "Daniel," he said, knowing she could not hear but hoping she might read his lips. Then he pointed to her with a questioning expression. She understood that much at least. She pointed to herself and her lips moved, forming shapes that made no sound but that he could interpret. "Lily," he said aloud, and she nodded, relief flooding her expression at this small success. They stood looking at each other across the small bedroom, two strangers who had promised to build a life together, separated by a wall of silence that seemed insurmountable. But Daniel saw something in that moment, saw the way she held herself despite her fear, saw the courage it must have taken to travel across half the country to marry a stranger when she could not hear or speak. He made a decision then, one that would shape everything that followed. He held up one finger, gesturing for her to wait, and went to his desk in the main room. He found paper and a pencil and brought them back to her. He handed them over and watched as her eyes lit up with hope. She wrote quickly, her handwriting as elegant as the letter he had received. "I cannot hear or speak. My sister wrote my letters to you. I am sorry for the deception, but I had no other choice. If you want to send me back, I understand." Daniel took the pencil and paper from her shaking hands and wrote his response carefully. "You are my wife now, or will be soon. I do not send away what is mine to protect. We will figure this out together." The relief on her face was so profound that more tears fell, but these seemed different from the frightened ones she had cried in the wagon. She wrote again, "I can work hard. I can cook and clean and tend animals. I can earn my keep." "You are not a hired hand," Daniel wrote back. "You are to be my partner in this life. Rest today. Tomorrow we will begin learning how to talk to each other." That night, Daniel lay in his own bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the frightened young woman sleeping in the next room. He thought about the hand movements she had made, the way her fingers had formed shapes and patterns that clearly meant something. Somewhere, there were people who understood that language. Somewhere, there was a way for him to learn it. The next morning, after a breakfast where they communicated through awkward gestures and written notes, Daniel took the wagon into town. Twin Falls was small but growing, with new people arriving regularly. He started at the general store, asking the owner if he knew anything about sign language or anyone in the territory who might be deaf. "There was a man through here last spring," the store owner said, scratching his jaw. "Traveling preacher. He had a deaf daughter and they used hand signs to talk. He might have mentioned something about a school for the deaf in Boise, but do not quote me on that." Boise was a 2-day ride away, but Daniel was already making plans. He visited the small schoolhouse next, where the young teacher listened to his question thoughtfully. "I have heard of manual alphabets," she said. "Ways to spell out words with your hands. I saw a book about it once, years ago when I was training in Boston. It was called fingerspelling, I think." The book might have been about something called the American Manual Alphabet. Daniel felt hope stirring. "Do you remember any of it?" She shook her head apologetically. "Only that it existed. Perhaps you could write to a school for the deaf. I know there are some back east." Before Daniel left town, He stopped at the small post office and composed a letter to the Idaho Territorial Legislature, another to the School for the Deaf in Boise, and a third to a university in Boston, asking for any information they could provide about sign language and how he might learn it. He had no idea how long it might take to receive responses, but he felt he was at least taking action. When he returned to the ranch, he found Lily hanging laundry on the line he had strung between two posts. She had found his spare work clothes and was washing them, though he had told her to rest. When she saw him approach, she wiped her wet hands on her apron and watched him nervously. Daniel pulled out a small book he had purchased at the general store. It was a child's alphabet primer with pictures of each letter. He opened it to the first page and showed it to Lily, pointing to the letter and then to the corresponding picture. She looked confused at first, then he took her hand gently and shaped her fingers into what he hoped might be a way to represent the letter. He had no idea if he was doing it correctly, but he was trying. Understanding lit her face like sunshine. She pulled her hand away gently and formed a different shape, fingers closed in a fist with the thumb resting along the side. She pointed firmly to the letter A, then made the shape again. Daniel copied her carefully, and she nodded encouragingly. She was teaching him, he realized. She knew this alphabet he was trying to fumble through. They spent the rest of that afternoon working through the alphabet. Lily was a patient teacher, correcting his finger positions gently and making him practice each letter until he could form it without hesitation. By evening, Daniel could fingerspell his name slowly, and Lily had clapped her hands together in delight when he managed it correctly. That night, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table eating the stew she had prepared, Daniel fingerspelled a word letter by letter. Thankyu. Lily's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. She fingerspelled back, Yourewelcome. Progress was slow but steady. Each day Daniel worked his ranch, tending to his small herd of cattle and his horses, mending fences and maintaining his property. Each evening he sat with Lily and they taught each other. She showed him more signs, beyond just the alphabet. She taught him the signs for common words, for food and water and sleep and work. He was clumsy at first, his hands too big and rough to form the delicate movements she made so effortlessly, but he practiced constantly. 3 weeks after Lily's arrival, Daniel hitched up the wagon and indicated that they were going to town. Lily looked nervous but gathered her shawl. The ride was more comfortable than their first one together. Daniel had learned the sign for pretty and pointed out flowers and birds along the way, making the sign and earning shy smiles from Lily. In town, they visited the general store together. The owner's wife was there, a kind woman named Martha who had been curious about Daniel's new bride. When she saw Lily, she smiled warmly and spoke a greeting. Lily, of course, did not respond verbally, and Daniel saw the confusion cross Martha's face. "My wife is deaf," Daniel said clearly, and he saw several townspeople nearby turn to look. "She communicates with sign language. We are learning to talk to each other." There was a moment of silence, and then Martha smiled even more warmly. "Well then, welcome to Twin Falls, Mrs. Jackson. We are glad to have you here." Lily could not hear the words, but Daniel turned to her and fingerspelled what Martha had said. It took him several minutes, his fingers moving slowly and carefully. Lily watched intently, and when he finished, she smiled at Martha and made a sign that Daniel recognized as "thank you." "She says thank you," Daniel translated, and Martha nodded. They made several more stops that day, and at each one, Daniel introduced Lily plainly, explaining about her deafness and answering questions patiently. Some people stared rudely, others were kind, but through it all, Daniel stayed close to Lily, making sure she knew she was not alone. On the way home, Lily touched Daniel's arm to get his attention. When he looked at her, she finger-spelled slowly. "Thankyoufornotbeingashed." Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. He finger-spelled back, "Nevershmed. Youremywife." They were not yet married officially, he realized. They would need to remedy that soon. But already she felt like his wife, like she belonged with him. 5 weeks after Lily's arrival, responses to Daniel's letters began arriving. The school in Boise sent a packet of information, including drawings of hand signs and descriptions of how to form them. The letter explained that American Sign Language was still developing, that different communities used different signs, but that there were some standards being established. They included as much information as they could, along with a note saying that they sometimes held workshops for hearing family members who wanted to learn to communicate with their deaf relatives. Daniel and Lily pored over the materials together. Some of the signs Lily already knew, others were new to her. They learned together, practicing constantly. Daniel discovered that Lily had learned her signs from her deaf mother, who had learned them from other deaf people in New York where Lily had grown up. Her mother had died 3 years ago, and Lily had been living with her hearing sister and brother-in-law since then. One evening, as they practiced new signs by lamplight, Lily set down the papers and reached for their slate to write something. "My sister's husband wanted me gone. He said I was a burden. My sister found your advertisement and wrote to you without telling me all the details. I did not know you were not expecting me to be deaf until I arrived and saw your face." Daniel read the words twice, feeling anger rise in his chest at the thought of anyone treating Lily as a burden. He took the chalk and wrote, "His loss is my gain. I am glad you are here." Lily's eyes met his, and he saw something shift in her expression. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand over his where it rested on the table. It was the first time she had initiated any kind of touch, and Daniel held very still, not wanting to frighten her. Her hand was warm and small, her fingers stained with chalk dust. They sat like that for a long moment, the lamplight flickering across both their faces, before Lily slowly withdrew her hand and returned to studying the signs. 2 months after Lily's arrival, in October when the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek had turned golden, Daniel and Lily traveled back to town for their wedding. The circuit judge was visiting, and Daniel had arranged for a simple ceremony. The young schoolteacher had agreed to interpret for Lily. Having studied the materials Daniel had shared with her, Lily wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Daniel had bought for her, pale blue with white lace at the collar. She looked beautiful and terrified as they stood before the judge in the small church. Daniel wore his best suit, uncomfortable in the starched collar but determined to do this properly. The judge spoke the traditional words, and the schoolteacher signed them for Lily. When it came time for vows, Daniel spoke his aloud, and then he turned to Lily and signed them as well, his movements still clumsy but sincere. "I promise to care for you, to protect you, to honor you all my days." Lily's hands shook as she signed her own vows back. Daniel understood most of it, enough to know she was promising the same things. The judge pronounced them married, and Daniel leaned in to kiss his wife gently, their first real kiss, brief and sweet. The townspeople who had gathered clapped, and Martha had prepared a small celebration at her home. It was nothing fancy, just cake and coffee and well wishes, but it made the marriage feel real and celebrated. Daniel watched Lily relax gradually throughout the afternoon, saw her smile more freely as several of the town women made efforts to communicate with her through gestures and expressions. That night back at the ranch, Daniel and Lily stood awkwardly in the main room, both aware that they were truly married now, that expectations had changed. Daniel signed. "Your room is still yours. We go slow." Relief and something else, perhaps disappointment, crossed Lily's face. She nodded and signed back. "Thank you for understanding." But an hour later, as Daniel lay in his bed staring at the darkness, he heard his door creak open. Lily stood silhouetted in the doorway in her white nightgown, nervous but determined. She could not speak to explain what she wanted, but she did not need to. Daniel lifted the blanket in invitation, and she crossed the room to slip into bed beside him. They lay facing each other in the darkness, and Daniel reached out to touch her face gently. She leaned into his palm, and then she closed the distance between them. Their kisses were tentative at first, then deeper as fear gave way to trust and something warmer. Daniel was careful with her, patient, and Lily responded with a passion that surprised them both. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Lily took Daniel's hand and placed it over her heart so he could feel it beating. Then she took his other hand and formed the sign for love, guiding his fingers through the movement. She did it again, making sure he understood. Love. Daniel repeated the sign, then pulled her close against his chest where she fit perfectly. He had not expected to fall in love with his mail-order bride. He had expected companionship at best, someone to share the burdens of ranch life. But here in the darkness, holding this brave, fierce woman who had traveled so far and risked so much for a chance at a new life, he felt his heart expanding with feelings he had never experienced before. Winter came to Idaho Territory with snow that piled high against the ranch house walls and wind that howled through the canyon lands. Daniel and Lily settled into married life, learning each other's rhythms and habits. Lily proved to be an excellent cook, a skilled seamstress, and surprisingly good with the horses. Daniel discovered that she could feel their approaching hoofbeats through the ground before he could hear them, that her other senses had sharpened to compensate for her lack of hearing. They continued studying sign language together, and Daniel practiced constantly until his hands moved with increasing fluency. They developed their own signs for things specific to their life, for the places on the ranch and the animals they tended. Communication became easier, richer, and Daniel found himself talking to Lily more than he had ever talked to anyone. One evening in late December, as a blizzard raged outside and they sat close to the fire, Lily taught Daniel to sign stories. She told him about her childhood in New York, about her deaf mother who had been treated as simple-minded despite her sharp intelligence, about learning to navigate a world that did not want to make space for people like her. Daniel signed back his own stories, about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about heading west after his parents died, about building this ranch from nothing with his own two hands. They talked late into the night, and Daniel realized this was what marriage should be, this sharing of souls and stories. In January, Lily began teaching Daniel more complex signs, emotional concepts that went beyond simple words. She showed him the sign for lonely, and then she made it in past tense and pointed to herself, then to Daniel. She had been lonely, but was not anymore. Daniel signed back the same sentiment, adding the sign for love that she had taught him their wedding night. Lily's face softened, and she launched herself across the space between them to kiss him deeply. They made love there in front of the fire, slow and sweet, and Daniel thought about how wrong he had been to pity himself for being alone. He had needed to be alone so that he would appreciate fully what he had now. By spring, Daniel could hold full conversations in sign language, his hands moving with confidence through complex thoughts and ideas. He signed with Lily while they worked together in the garden she had planted, while they rode out to check on the cattle, while they lay in bed at night planning their future. Lily had never been able to have conversations like this with hearing people. She explained to him one day. Her sister had learned only basic signs, enough to communicate necessities, but never enough for real understanding. Daniel was the first hearing person who had truly learned her language, who had cared enough to meet her in her world instead of expecting her to somehow exist in his. In June, Lily missed her monthly courses and she looked at Daniel with wide eyes as she signed the news. They were going to have a baby. Daniel felt terror and joy flood through him in equal measure. He pulled Lily close and signed against her shoulder, "We will be good parents. Together." The pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated. Daniel rode to town regularly to consult with the midwife, and he brought back books about childbirth that he and Lily read together. The midwife, Mrs. Patterson, was a practical woman in her 50s who had delivered half the babies in Twin Falls. When Daniel explained about Lily's deafness, she nodded thoughtfully. "Hearing or not, having a baby is having a baby," she said. "The body knows what to do. I will come when her time is near and we will manage just fine." Through the summer and fall, Daniel watched Lily's belly grow with their child. She remained active, still working alongside him though he tried to make her rest more. She was stubborn and strong, and he loved her more each day. One October afternoon, Daniel was mending a fence line when he felt vibrations through the ground. He turned to see Lily running toward him, awkward with her large belly, waving her arms to get his attention. When she reached him, she signed quickly, "Baby coming. Now." Daniel's mind went blank with panic for a moment before training took over. He helped Lily into the wagon and drove toward town faster than was probably wise, but she held onto the seat and did not complain. The vibrations of the wagon seemed to comfort her, or perhaps it was just his presence beside her. Mrs. Patterson was at home when they arrived, and she took one look at Lily and nodded. "Bring her inside. First babies take time, but we best get ready." Daniel carried Lily into the midwife's home and settled her in the room Mrs. Patterson prepared. He stayed by Lily's side throughout, holding her hand and signing encouragement when the pains came. "You are strong. You can do this. I am here." Lily could not cry out with the contractions, but Daniel could see the pain in her face, in the way her body tensed. He felt helpless, wishing he could take the pain for her, but all he could do was be present and let her squeeze his hand hard enough to leave bruises. The labor lasted through the afternoon and into the evening. Mrs. Patterson was calm and efficient, and when she needed to communicate something to Lily, she spoke to Daniel and he signed the information. It was not perfect, but it worked. As night fell and lamps were lit, Mrs. Patterson examined Lily and signed to Daniel, "Soon now. Tell her to push with the next pain." Daniel relayed the information, and Lily nodded tiredly. When the contraction came, she bore down with all her strength, and Daniel supported her, signing encouragement between pushing. "Good. You are doing so good, almost there. I see the head, just a little more." With a final push, their baby slid into Mrs. Patterson's waiting hands. The midwife worked quickly, clearing the infant's nose and mouth, and then a thin wail filled the room. She wrapped the baby in a clean blanket and handed the bundle to Daniel. "You have a son," Mrs. Patterson said, smiling. Daniel looked down at the tiny red face of his newborn child, feeling his heart crack open with love so intense it hurt. He turned to Lily, who was watching his face anxiously, and he signed with one hand while cradling the baby in his other arm. "Boy, we have a son. He is perfect." Lily reached out with shaking arms, and Daniel placed their son against her chest. She looked down at the baby, and tears streamed down her face as she touched his tiny fingers, his soft, dark hair. The baby was still crying, and Daniel could see the moment Lily felt the vibrations against her chest, the way her eyes widened with wonder. "She can feel him, Mrs. Patterson said softly. Babies cry strong enough for that. Daniel knelt beside the bed and put his hand over Lily's where it rested on their son's back. They stayed like that, the three of them, until the baby quieted and dozed off against Lily's warmth. They named him David Harper Jackson, and he was the image of his mother with her blonde hair and delicate features, but with Daniel's brown eyes. David was a healthy baby with strong lungs, and Daniel quickly learned that, while Lily could not hear his cries from another room, she could feel them when she held him, could sense his distress through other means. Daniel watched in amazement as Lily learned to mother their son. She kept him close always, her awareness of him almost supernatural. When David was hungry or wet or tired, Lily knew before he started fussing. She sang to him in her own way, humming deep in her chest so he could feel the vibrations. She signed to him constantly, her hands forming words and stories that Daniel translated with his voice. They moved back to the ranch when David was a week old, and they settled into the chaos of new parenthood. Daniel took on more of the household tasks, so Lily could focus on the baby, and he found he did not mind washing dishes or doing laundry when it meant Lily could rest. The town women came to visit, bringing food and gifts and advice. Martha taught Lily to nurse lying down so she could rest while feeding the baby. Another woman showed her how to make a sling to carry David against her body while she worked. The community that had been uncertain about the deaf mail-order bride had come to embrace Lily fully, seeing her strength and capability. David grew quickly, a happy baby who smiled easily and reached for everything within grasp. At 3 months old, he started babbling, making sounds that he could hear but his mother could not. Daniel would sign to Lily what sounds David was making, and she would place her hand on the baby's chest to feel the vibrations of his voice. One evening when David was 6 months old, Daniel was holding the baby and signing over his head to Lily about plans for expanding the cattle herd. David reached up and grabbed Daniel's moving fingers, fascinated by the motion. He brought Daniel's hand to his mouth and tried to eat it, and both parents laughed. "He likes the signing," Lily signed to Daniel. "We will teach him. He will grow up speaking 2 languages." Daniel loved that idea, loved the thought of their son being fluent in both spoken English and sign language, able to move seamlessly between his parents' worlds. He began signing to David as much as he spoke, narrating everything they did. "Now we are changing your diaper. Yes, I know you hate this part. Almost done." David's eyes would follow the movement of Daniel's hands, his own little fingers trying to mimic the shapes, even though he was far too young to form real signs. As David approached his first birthday, Twin Falls was growing rapidly. The railroad was coming through, bringing more settlers, more businesses, more opportunities. Daniel's ranch was thriving, his herd larger than ever, and he was considering hiring help for the first time. One afternoon in early autumn, a young man rode up to the ranch looking for work. He was about 20, rail thin and dusty from travel, but he had an honest face. His name was Samuel Pierce, and he had experience with cattle. "I can work hard, sir," Samuel said. "I do not need much, just a place to sleep and fair wages." Daniel was about to agree when Lily came out of the house carrying David on her hip. Samuel's eyes widened slightly when Lily did not respond to his greeting, and Daniel saw questions forming. "This is my wife, Lily, and our son, David," Daniel said. "Lily is deaf. We communicate with sign language." He had learned to state this plainly, matter-of-factly, as if daring anyone to have a problem with it. Samuel looked at Lily and then back at Daniel. "My grandmother was deaf, sir. She taught me some signs when I was small. I have forgotten most of it, but I remember a little." Daniel felt Lily touch his arm. When he looked at her, she signed, "Ask him to show me." Daniel translated and Samuel looked nervous but made a few basic signs. "Hello, my name." He fingerspelled Samuel slowly. Lily's face lit up with delight. She signed back quickly and Samuel caught maybe one word in three, but he grinned. "I remember that one. Nice to meet you." "You are hired," Daniel said. "We will teach you the rest of the signs as we go." Samuel proved to be a good worker and a quick learner. Within weeks, he could hold simple conversations with Lily, and she seemed to enjoy having another person to sign with. David adored Samuel, reaching for him whenever he came near. One evening, after Samuel had been with them for 2 months, Daniel and Lily sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Idaho sky in shades of orange and pink. David was asleep inside, and Samuel was in the small bunkhouse Daniel had built for him. "I am happy," Lily signed to Daniel. "Happier than I ever thought I could be." "Me too," Daniel signed back. He reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Do you ever regret coming here, marrying a stranger?" Lily was quiet for a moment, watching the last rays of sunlight fade. Then she signed. "I was so scared on that stagecoach. Scared you would send me away, scared you would be cruel, scared I would spend my whole life being a burden to someone who did not want me." Daniel's chest tightened at the thought of what she had endured. "When I saw your face at the stagecoach," Lily continued, "I saw confusion but not meanness. And then you tried so hard to understand me. You picked up that alphabet book and tried to learn." She turned to look directly at Daniel. "That was when I started falling in love with you. When I saw you were willing to try." Daniel lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles. "I fell in love with you the day you taught me the alphabet. I saw your patience, your intelligence, your strength. I thought, this woman is remarkable and somehow she is mine." They kissed as the stars began appearing overhead, and Daniel thought about the advertisement he had placed 2 years ago, how he had been looking for a wife to ease his loneliness. He had gotten so much more than that. He had gotten a partner, a love that transformed him, a family that made every hardship worthwhile. David's first word, spoken when he was just over a year old, was Dada, and his first sign was more, which he used enthusiastically at mealtimes. He grew into a bright, active toddler who ran everywhere and got into everything. By the time he was 2, he was signing full sentences to his mother and speaking clearly to his father, switching between languages without conscious thought. Daniel loved watching Lily with their son, loved seeing the special bond they shared. She would sit with David for hours, teaching him signs, telling him stories with her hands, and he would watch her with complete attention, his little fingers mimicking her movements. One afternoon, Daniel came in from working the cattle to find Lily sitting at the kitchen table crying. He hurried to her side, frightened something was wrong. "What happened? Is David hurt?" She shook her head and signed. "He told me he loves me." In words. He said it out loud even though he knew I could not hear it, and then he signed it. "I love you, Mama." Daniel felt his own eyes sting with tears. He pulled Lily into his arms and held her while she cried happy tears into his shirt. That evening, after David was asleep, Daniel and Lily made love slowly and tenderly, and a few weeks later, Lily signed to Daniel that she thought she might be pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first. Lily was more tired, more sick, and Daniel worried constantly. But Mrs. Patterson assured him that every pregnancy was different, that Lily was healthy and strong. In late spring, when the wildflowers covered the hills in a carpet of color, Lily gave birth to a daughter they named Lucy Marie Jackson. Lucy had Daniel's dark hair and Lily's delicate features, and she was a quieter baby than David had been. Where David had been all energy and noise, Lucy was contemplative and calm. David, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to hold her constantly. "Gentle," Lily would sign to him, guiding his hands to support Lucy's head properly. "She is very small." "I am a good big brother," David would sign back seriously, and both his parents would hide smiles. The ranch continued to prosper. With Samuel's help, Daniel had expanded significantly, and they were now selling cattle to the railroad contractors and to the army at Fort Boise. Money was less tight, and Daniel was able to buy Lily nice things: a new stove for the kitchen, fabric for dresses, books that they read together in the evenings. When Lucy was 6 months old, Daniel decided to build an addition onto the house, more bedrooms for their growing family, and a larger kitchen. He and Samuel did most of the work themselves, and Lily helped when she could, keeping David entertained and Lucy content while the men hammered and sawed. The new rooms were finished by the time Lucy turned 1, and the house felt more like a true home than ever before. David had his own room now, painted blue with a window overlooking the mountains. Lucy's room was smaller but cozy, with a rocking chair where Lily nursed her and sang silent lullabies. On a warm evening in June, the whole family sat outside watching the sunset. David was signing an elaborate story to his mother about a rabbit he had seen that day, his small hands moving expressively. Lucy sat in Daniel's lap, chewing on her fist and drooling on his shirt. Samuel had ridden into town to visit a girl he had been courting, the daughter of the blacksmith. "Samuel is going to get married," Lily signed to Daniel. "I can tell by the way he talks about her." "Good for him," Daniel signed back. "Should we offer to let them build a house here on the ranch? That would be kind. He is like family now." Daniel nodded, thinking about how much their lives had changed since that hot August day when Lily had stepped off the stagecoach looking terrified and lost. He had thought he was getting a mail-order bride, a practical arrangement to make his life easier. Instead, he had found everything he had never known he needed. David finished his story and climbed into Lily's lap, tired from a long day of playing. "Mama, tell me about when you were little," he signed. Lily looked at Daniel, and he nodded encouragingly. She began signing, telling David about growing up in New York City, about the deaf community there, about her mother who had been strong and brave despite a world that did not value her. "Grandma was deaf like you," David signed, fascinated. "Yes, she taught me to be proud of who I am. To not let anyone make me feel less than whole. You are whole, Mama. You are perfect." Lily pulled her son close and kissed the top of his head. Over David's blonde hair, her eyes met Daniel's, and he saw in them the same overwhelming love he felt. The years passed quickly after that, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growth of their children. David grew tall and strong like his father, learning to ride and rope and work cattle. Lucy grew into a thoughtful, artistic child who loved to draw, and who had inherited her mother's patience and grace. When David was 8 and Lucy was 5, Lily gave birth to twin boys, Matthew and Marcus, identical in every way except that Matthew had a small birthmark on his left shoulder. The twins were whirlwinds of energy, keeping everyone constantly busy. David took his role as oldest seriously, helping corral his younger brothers and teaching Lucy to ride. The children were all bilingual, switching seamlessly between signing and speaking, and Daniel loved listening to the chatter of voices and watching the dance of hands at the dinner table. Samuel had indeed married the blacksmith's daughter, a sweet girl named Emma, and they had built a small house on the ranch. They had 2 children of their own now, and the ranch felt less like a lonely outpost and more like a real community. Twin Falls had grown into a proper town with a school, several churches, a bank, and a railroad depot. Daniel served on the town council, and Lily was active in the women's auxiliary, planning social events and helping newcomers settle in. The school had initially been uncertain about accepting David because of his mother's deafness, worried that he would be somehow behind in his development. But David proved to be one of the brightest students in his class, fluent in both languages and able to help when the school eventually enrolled other deaf students. When David was 10, he came home from school excited about something. He signed rapidly to his mother while speaking to his father simultaneously, a skill that never ceased to amaze Daniel. There is a new family in town with a deaf boy. He is 9 and he does not know any sign language. His family never learned. Can I teach him? Of course, Lily signed. Bring him here after school. I will help. The boy's name was Timothy, and he was shy and frustrated, trying to communicate in a world that did not understand him. But David befriended him immediately, teaching him signs with the same patience his mother had shown. Within months, Timothy was signing fluently, and his parents had learned basic signs too. Grateful for the change in their son, it became a pattern. Whenever a deaf child or adult appeared in Twin Falls or the surrounding areas, they found their way to the Jackson Ranch. Lily welcomed them all, teaching, encouraging, building a community of deaf and hearing people who could communicate across the divide. One evening, when Daniel was 45 and Lily was 37, they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. The twins were racing each other to the barn. Lucy was drawing in the dirt with a stick, and David was practicing his roping on a fence post. We built something good here, Daniel signed to Lily. You built it, Lily signed back. You learned my language when you did not have to. You made me feel safe when I was so scared. Daniel thought back to those early days, to the terrified young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, to his own uncertainty about how they would manage. I learned your language because I needed to talk to my wife. That is all. It was everything, Lily signed. It changed my whole life. You changed mine, Daniel signed back. Before you came, I was lonely and did not even know it. I thought having someone to cook meals and wash clothes would be enough. But you taught me what partnership really means. What love really means. Lily leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Idaho mountains they both loved. When David turned 18, he announced his intention to stay on the ranch rather than head off to university or seek his fortune elsewhere. This is where I belong, he signed to his parents. I want to build my life here like you did. Daniel felt pride and relief flood through him. He had worried that David would feel stifled by ranch life, that he would want to see the world. But David loved the land as much as Daniel did, and he had grown into a skilled rancher. Lucy, at 15, had different dreams. She wanted to go to school in Boise to study art and teaching. I want to teach deaf children, she signed. Like Mama taught us, I want to make sure they have the same opportunities as hearing children. Lily cried when Lucy told them this, proud tears for a daughter who had grown up watching her mother navigate a hearing world and wanted to make that world more accessible for others. The twins, at 13, were still deciding what they wanted, but they had time. They were both fascinated by the railroad and talked constantly about becoming engineers or conductors. On a crisp October morning in 1891, Daniel woke before dawn as he had every day for decades. He looked over at Lily sleeping beside him, her hair silver now, and her face lined with the marks of a life fully lived. She was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. He thought about the journey they had taken together, from strangers who could not communicate to partners who understood each other perfectly. He thought about their children and grandchildren, about the community they had built, about the deaf people who had found refuge and acceptance in Twin Falls because of Lily's courage and strength. Lily's eyes opened and she caught him staring. "What?" she signed sleepily. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," Daniel signed back. "We are both lucky," Lily signed. "We found each other." They rose and began another day, moving through the familiar rhythms of ranch life. Daniel went out to check on the cattle while Lily made breakfast. David came up from his house, where he now lived with his wife, to discuss plans for the day. Lucy was visiting from Boise on her school break, and she helped her mother in the kitchen while signing stories about her students. That evening, the whole extended family gathered for dinner as they did every Sunday. The table was crowded with children and grandchildren, with Samuel and Emma and their kids, with friends from town who had become like family. The room was filled with the noise of conversation and laughter, with hands signing and voices speaking, with the beautiful chaos of a life well lived. Daniel looked around the table at all these people he loved, at the family he and Lily had created, and he felt his heart swell with gratitude. He caught Lily's eye across the table and signed to her, "I love you." She signed back, "I love you too, always." After everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Daniel and Lily sat on their porch under the stars as they had done thousands of times before. The night was cool and clear, and Daniel pulled Lily close against his side to keep her warm. "You remember the first night we sat here," Daniel signed. "Right after we were married." "I remember everything," Lily signed back. "I remember being so scared and so hopeful at the same time. I remember thinking I would never be able to communicate with you properly, that we would always be strangers. But you learned," Lily signed. "You learned my language and you taught me yours. You made me feel safe when I thought I would never be safe again." Daniel thought about those 3 words he had struggled to express to her in those early days, before he knew more than a few basic signs. "You are safe now," he had wanted to tell her. It had taken him weeks to be able to sign it properly, but he had never stopped trying to make it true. "You are safe now," he signed to her in the darkness, the same words he had learned all those years ago. "I know," Lily signed back. "I have always known, from that very first day when you could have sent me away but chose to learn instead. You made me a promise without words, and you kept it every single day." They sat together under the vast Idaho sky, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life on the foundation of respect and effort and deep, abiding love. Around them, the ranch was quiet, the cattle settled for the night, the children safe in their homes, the future unfolding with promise. Daniel thought about the scared young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 15 years ago, and the lonely rancher who had been waiting for her without knowing it. He thought about how they had bridged the silence between them with patience and determination and love. The years continued to roll by gently after that, bringing more grandchildren and great-grandchildren, bringing changes to the West as it became less wild and more settled. But through it all, Daniel and Lily remained constants to each other. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated weddings and births, mourned losses and setbacks, always together, always communicating perfectly in the language they had learned together. When Daniel was 65 and Lily was 57, they sat on their porch on a summer evening much like the thousands that had come before. Their children were grown and successful, their grandchildren were thriving, and the ranch that Daniel had built alone was now a family enterprise spanning multiple generations. "Tell me again about the day we met," Lily signed to Daniel, as she had asked him to do countless times over the years. Daniel smiled and began the familiar story, his hands moving through the signs with the ease of decades of practice. "It was August, blazing hot, and I was standing in the dust waiting for a stagecoach. I was nervous because I was about to meet my mail-order bride. I had no idea my whole life was about to change. What did you think when you saw me? Lily signed. I thought you looked terrified, and then I thought you looked brave. And then I realized you were deaf, and I had no idea how to talk to you, and I thought, well, Daniel, you have really gotten yourself into something now. Lily laughed silently, her shoulders shaking with mirth. And what do you think now? Daniel reached over and took her hand, lifting it to his lips to kiss her knuckles as he had done countless times before. I think that stepping off that stagecoach was the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do. I think learning to communicate with you was the best decision I ever made. I think loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. You made me feel safe, Lily signed with her free hand. You make me feel safe still. Always, Daniel signed back. That is my promise. You are safe now, you are safe forever, as long as I have breath in my body. They sat together as the stars emerged overhead, as they had done for decades. Two people who had found each other across silence and fear and uncertainty, who had built a life on the foundation of communication and respect and deep, unwavering love. Around them, their legacy lived and breathed in the children and grandchildren who spoke two languages fluently, who understood that love meant meeting someone where they were and learning their language, who carried forward the values that Daniel and Lily had demonstrated every day of their married life. The ranch stretched out around them in the gathering darkness, the land they had worked and loved and passed down to their children. In the distance, lights glowed from the houses of their family, testaments to the life they had built together. Daniel pulled Lily closer and signed against her shoulder where she could feel the movement of his hands. I would do it all again. Every moment, every challenge, every triumph. I would choose you every single time. Lily turned her face up to his and signed back. And I would step off that stagecoach again, scared and alone, knowing that you would be waiting for me, knowing that you would learn my language, knowing that you would keep me safe. They kissed under the stars, these two souls who had found each other and built something beautiful and lasting. The scared mail-order bride and the lonely rancher had become partners, lovers, friends, and family. They had raised children who would carry forward their values, who would remember that love meant communication, that safety meant trust, that family meant accepting each other fully. As they finally rose to go inside for the night, Daniel signed one more thing to his beloved wife. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for being brave enough to come. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for learning my language, Lily signed back. Thank you for making me feel seen and heard even though I could not hear. Thank you for loving me exactly as I am. They walked inside together, hands linked, hearts intertwined, living proof that love could bridge any divide, that communication was possible when both people cared enough to try, that the bravest thing anyone could do was risk everything for a chance at connection. Their story was not just their own. It belonged to their children and grandchildren, to the deaf community that had found acceptance in Twin Falls, to every person who had witnessed their partnership and learned that disability did not mean inability, that different ways of communicating were equally valid, that love was ultimately about choosing to understand each other. The mail-order bride had arrived deaf and scared, and the cowboy had learned sign language to say, "You are safe now." But it had become so much more than that. It had become a life partnership built on mutual respect and effort, a family created through love and acceptance, a legacy that would extend far beyond their own years. As Daniel and Lily prepared for bed that night, moving through their familiar routines with the ease of decades of practice, they both felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. They had faced challenges and overcome them together. They had raised children who were compassionate and capable. They had built a community that was richer for their presence. And most importantly, they had loved each other truly and completely, across silence and difference, proving that the heart had its own language that everyone could understand if they just took the time to learn. That was the real story, the one that mattered most. Not just that a deaf woman had arrived scared and alone, or that a hearing man had learned sign language, but that two people had chosen each other every single day, had worked to understand each other, had built a partnership based on respect and communication and deep, abiding love. They climbed into bed together as they had done for decades, fitting together perfectly. Daniel wrapped his arms around Lily, and she rested her head on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. No words needed to be signed in the darkness. They understood each other perfectly, these two souls who had found each other and built a beautiful life together. Outside, the Idaho night was filled with stars. The mountains stood eternal watch over the valley, and the ranch that Daniel and Lily had built together rested peacefully. Inside, two people who had overcome silence to find each other slept wrapped in each other's arms, safe and loved and home. That was their happy ending, their happily ever after. Not perfect because life was never perfect, but real and earned and true. They had started as strangers who could not communicate, and they had become partners who understood each other better than anyone else ever could. The scared mail-order bride had found safety and love. The lonely rancher had found family and purpose. Together, they had built something lasting and beautiful. And on quiet evenings, their children and grandchildren would gather around and ask them to tell the story again. The story of how grandmother Lily had arrived in Twin Falls scared and unable to hear, and how grandfather Daniel had learned sign language to communicate with her, how he had made her feel safe, how they had fallen in love and built this family together. The children would watch their grandparents sign to each other, would see the love in their eyes, would understand that this was what partnership looked like, what commitment looked like, what true love looked like. They would carry these lessons forward into their own lives, ensuring that the legacy of Daniel and Lily Jackson would continue for generations to come. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way, with Daniel signing to Lily, "You are safe now," and with Lily signing back, "I know. I have always known," and with both of them understanding that those simple words represented a promise kept every single day for a lifetime, a foundation upon which an entire family had been built, a testament to the power of choosing to understand, choosing to communicate, choosing to love. Their story was complete, their circle closed, their happily ever after fully realized. The mail-order bride and the cowboy had found each other, learned each other's languages, and built a beautiful life together in the wild lands of Idaho Territory. They had raised children, created community, and shown everyone around them that love knew no barriers when two people cared enough to bridge them. That was their ending, perfect in its imperfection, beautiful in its reality, true in every way that mattered. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The scared young woman and the lonely rancher had become legends in their own time, not for any grand deeds or dramatic adventures, but simply for choosing each other every day and showing the world what real partnership looked like. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.